morning, and welcome back to the CTA Webinar Series. I'm Jerry Briniger, your Webinar Track Chair. Today's topic is Projecting Prison Populations, a Scientific Look. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Linda Freeman and Conner Tuttle. Ms. Freeman is the Executive Director of the New Mexico Sentencing Commission, or NMSC, and served as its Deputy Director from 2010 to early 2016. She has established a research data repository, developed a method of estimating the costs of proposed criminal justice legislation, and partnered with the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee on the Pew MacArthur Results First initiative. She was previously a research scientist at the University of New Mexico's Institute for Social Research for 7 years and continues to work as an instructor in political science. She worked for the City of Albuquerque's Budget Office from 2001 to 2003 and the Administrative Office of the Court's Judicial Information Division from 1997 to 2001. She earned an MA in Political Science from the University of New Mexico. Conner Tuttle is a Research Scientist 3 at the New Mexico Sentencing Commission. He graduated from Texas A&M with an MA in Political Science focusing on public administration and quantitative analysis. Conner has experience in research and evaluation and has substantive training in public policy and public administration, economics, political science, and public health. His current work focuses on varying aspects of criminal justice and community concerns. Linda, Conner, welcome.
All right, so good morning again, everyone. Just to kind of give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. So first, we're going to go through a brief understanding of forecasting. So how it is that we get to the points that we're at. Then we're going to go through a technical process of forecasting. So we'll be going through kind of what programs we use and what kind of information we use to create a forecast. Then we're going to go into quality assurance and forecasting to make sure that we are providing accurate forecasting measures and then being able to check it. We will then be going through and explaining the prison population in a detailed look. We'll then be going through the aspirational ideas for future partnerships. And then after that, we'll have questions.
So just a note on that, although we've got some time allotted after the presentation for questions, if anyone has questions midstream along the way, feel free to put those in the chat window, and any that I see, I'll capture for later discussion.
All right, so just to give you kind of a quick thing, this is kind of our final project. This is where we're going. This is our current female prison population. And we thought this was more of an interesting look for the projection, as our female population has trends very differently and very widely. And so it's a much harder population to forecast and try to understand. So a brief understanding of why forecasts don't last. The reason why we need to keep working at it and keep looking at things is that we've got issues of time. So as time changes, of course, we have different legislation, which means people might have longer sentences. There may be changes in internal policy that could be affecting lump sum agreements or meritorious deduction. There are also just changes in the size of a state's population. As a state grows, and if we assume the same level of criminality, we're still going to have a greater population that might be in jail. Then we also have issues of season. So usually victimization will spike in the summer. Holidays affect caseload and which departments are processing through. And then also turnover may also be affected due to seasonal issues as well. And then we also have issues of other variables. So if employment and poverty and income inequality are affecting how frequently crimes are being committed, that can also possibly affect the prison population as well. So just to kind of give an example of how time can be a factor, as we can see overall, the rate of per 100,000 residents has been increasing over time, and only within these last few years has finally started to decrease to a level that is as low as 1997. But again, that over time we've seen that there's been an increase, of course, in the prison population. Now, if we look at also issues of season, we can see that, for example, this victimization spikes. Even though there's been an overall downward trend in the seasonal rates of household property victimization, you can see that for the most part, almost every summer, it spikes back up again. So now we're going to kind of get into some of the technical process. So what we use is the NMCD monthly high counts. And we use this as a safety mechanism so that if everyone had to be called back into the population, we would have enough space for them. We also, so when we're also gathering some of the data to be able to forecast, just to test this out, use the UCR with the reported crime and arrest data by each of the individual crime categories. I also usually track through the American Community Survey and the Bureau of Labor Statistics for things such as unemployment, poverty, income inequality, and a few others. And additionally, that it's important to try to understand how far out we would expect some of these to possibly affect the population. So in our case, I usually try to average out that if we see a massive change in poverty, income inequality, or unemployment, maybe around the 10-month time period is when we would expect that to affect the prison population if that would have affected criminal activity. So,
okay. Yeah, Linda here. And what the next slide that we're going to talk to you is about the subjectivity about when we start our forecast. And what we have here is a graph of the women's population from 2001 to approximately September of 2017. As researchers, we have to advise the department about when's the logical time to start the time series. So the time series is basically the amount of time that we're using in the forecast to project the population. I want to draw your attention to approximately December of 2006. If you look at January 1 of 2007, you can see that we had a high number that was over 700. At that point, there had been a gradual increase to that number. At that time, the New Mexico Corrections Department was operating 2 women's facilities, and it slowly ramped up to its high point, and as they closed the facility, we see that population went back down. I think that largely those were some artificial measures to kind of get the population back down. I can't speak to why it rose that steeply, but other than the availability of the facility. So we see that it went back down to a low period. When we were initially doing the forecast, we did not want to include that high point because including that high point would artificially take up the prison population because it would include that gradual increase up to that point. And what we actually observed was a decrease in population. But then again, in about 2015, we started to see some very erratic kind of population growth. So basically, we have to subjectively decide at what point we start the time series. And if we have prior knowledge about facilities that are no longer available, or if we have prior knowledge about trends that we might expect, it might influence what day we decide to use the time series. So in this case, we would not want to use the time period all the way back to 2001. And actually what we did is we started in 2010 so we could kind of naturally use the information that would help us predict the future forecast.
all right, and with that, now we're going to get into more additionally some of this technical process. So the program that we use to generate the forecast is SPSS 24, and specifically we use the time series modeling. And there are other programs before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of what's kind of going on in this slide. So some of the more common ones are going to be Stata and SAS, as other programs that you will hear that use high-level statistics to be able to generate forecasts. So to kind of understand what we're going through here is this is the start of what was effectively understanding the prior variables such as income inequality, median income, unemployment, poverty, and basically to be able to forecast them out. So whenever we want to try to use a variable or some other factor to affect the future time, we also have to forecast those variables. And so that's what this is effectively going to start doing. So what this is asking it to do is to use all the information that we have from the time periods Linda was discussing from about 2001 and to take each of these individual variables and extend them out. And then also within this expert modeler is to try out which models are going to be the best. Now, there are several different iterations of models and highly statistical information there, but effectively that you want to try different models to make sure that you're accurately predicting. And so with that, we'll kind of get into what these long-term forecasts look like. So overall, and this is kind of an important thing to get at as well, is that no forecast is completely useful forever, just because things change over time, things change in the season. But for the next maybe 3 to 5 years, they're still pretty useful. And so when we're looking at, for example, this income inequality, which was the Gini, we can say that probably that we would expect that maybe income inequality will decrease in New Mexico for the next 2 years. We can also expect that the median income will also increase over time. Maybe unemployment will drop and it'll divot. And then the same thing with levels of poverty that maybe we should expect for the next few years. Now, do we ever expect them to get lower than this 10? Probably not. But when we're trying to create a more accurate forecast within this certain time period, it's useful to have other measures to see if they can actually help in accurately predicting the forecast. So, and that's another thing that's important back to the issues of time, is that certain variables may only impact certain populations. So when we ran these forecasts for the males and the females, income inequality really only actually helped in accurately predicting the male population. And it's also important to note that even though we gathered all the information from the high counts and the UCR, unemployment, poverty, not many of these variables track through. And so you may be able to do, there might be a lot of front-end work in trying to get the data and try to run the models and things, but overall you still have to be, at the end of the day, you still have to test the forecast within it. And even though the Gini had helped the male population, it did not do anything for the female population. And the other reason why some of these things might not be as useful is that prison population can be driven by the DA caseload, and it can also be driven by officer policy and judicial policy. And so even though we may see poverty increase, and if we were to say maybe that affects drug crime or property crime, then maybe that's not what the DA is pushing for. Maybe that's not what the judicial system is wishing for. And it also may be that which crimes are actually being convicted is going to affect it. And so that's the reason why maybe some of these variables may not track, and just as understanding, but it still is a useful endeavor to try to see if there are some of these that will help in accurately predicting a forecast. All right. And then so this is actually basically rerunning the SPSS 24. This is a look again at the female population. This was effectively what the graph would have looked like just in SPSS before we moved it to the Excel on, I believe it was slide 4. So just to kind of give a base understanding of what this looks like in the statistical program. So when we look at this, first of all, the number of predictors is 0. So even though we may have applied several different types of data and information, it didn't really matter. We also want to be able to see kind of what our R-square is looking like. Does it actually, when we are making this prediction, how accurately is this actually predicting what the actual population is? And that's just kind of the basis. There are additional numbers here. If you're interested, we can talk about them, but not to get bogged down in the statistics and why these matter. We'll continue on.
Just on that point, Conner, I was just going to quickly add, sometimes when Conner was saying that, we want to know how well it's predicting, in some cases we'll roll back time and we'll act like we didn't have certain numbers for our past period, and we can see how well the model would have predicted what actually happened. And that's one of the ways that we can get confidence that the model's predicting well.
And that's kind of a perfect transition into basically our quality assurance. So even though we added all these extra variables, overall what we like and the most basic information we need are just the high counts. And these are really our preferred numbers, as effectively the means are subject to outliers. So and some of the problems that we have is sometimes we get these numbers that show maybe 200 to 300 people less, and so that can actually effectively change where the population is forecasting. And overall, we want to be able to say, okay, if everyone was called in sometime this month, would the prison actually have physical capacity to hold that many people? Versus the mean, where they may actually have a large number of days where they're getting close to the capacity, but it still is underrating them. And so we maintain the high count as both a safety mechanism, and also just to make sure that those people will always be able to be housed. And then when we start going on to kind of the quality assurance, so we were talking about how things change over time. How long should we expect before earned meritorious deductions will affect the population that we have? Should we see a general shift, and will it take maybe a year, maybe 10 years? How is the parole length changing? Is that going to affect the prison population over which time? How is the legislation going to change? And should we expect this to increase the population? And one of the other things is that we would roll back the time and say, okay, so if this legislation were to have occurred 2 years ago, where do we expect the population would be today? And additionally, one of the ways we also try to make sure for quality assurance is that we want to make sure that if we're over-predicting, we want to make sure that we're over-predicting and under-predicting, because then hopefully we're somewhere in between. But if we're constantly over-predicting, then we are compiling the error, which means that we will always have an over-biased estimate, and that may not be useful when it comes to budgetary matters and so on. And so we want something that is fluctuating, so that way it's a more accurate description of the population as a whole. And we'll actually show that in a few graphs here on this next slide. And additionally, how far back should we expect past events to affect the changes? We may have had legislation that is updated for this year, but there are still prisoners that are still under the old rules. And so do we expect that those people that are under the old rules, how is that going to play into the future, or is it? So this kind of goes into the question of error compiling. So when we were trying to decide whether or not to do to create a new forecast, it was pretty clear that we needed to. And this kind of goes back to rolling back time. I believe this forecast was generated in July of 2015, the prior one. And so effectively you can see that even back in January January 1st of 2015, it was over predicting where the actual population was. And contractually we try to stick with a 3% margin of error. And the other concern is that sometimes this actually can also be artificially driven, because sometimes you have additional individuals who are release eligible, and so we try to make sure that we're within a margin of error that's accurate, so that way it can be useful for budgetary and for prison planning, among other uses. So, and finally, we get back to kind of where we started. This is what we end up with as our future prison population. And currently, we are kind of expecting that every year, New Mexico will add 6 new females to the prison population. And this is kind of the overall general trend from the time period. And when looking back at the old information, this looks to be a fairly accurate model going forward. And with that, I will hand it back over to Linda.
So in addition to the actual prison population forecast, we use a variety of different measures to help explain this to policymakers, including members of the state legislature. What we use to understand the population, how it affects the future population, basically are new admissions by type of crime. And that's really important, and I have a graph later on, but basically why that's important is we want to track the violent, and in particular the serious violent offenders who have a different earned meritorious deduction rule. We also look at the number of admissions that are parole revocations versus those that are new admissions. And when we say new admissions, we're talking about a return. It can either be a first-time admission or a readmission for a new crime. We also look at prison admissions to releases as a ratio. So we want to see on any given month, are we gaining population or are we losing population as a percent of the total population? Additionally, we look at changes in earned meritorious deduction. The New Mexico Sentencing Commission is obligated through our enabling statute to calculate the amount of earned meritorious deduction that is awarded to inmates, and it's based on a presumption. But what we find is that changes in policy about the awarding of the earned meritorious deduction can impact population. So looking at next, our first graph is about new admissions by crime type and year. This graph looks at, basically we use 6 different categories. So the SVO is the serious violent offender, and that references a statute in New Mexico that outlines a number of crimes that if you commit those crimes, you are considered a serious violent offender, and you're only eligible for 4 days of good time per month, contingent on you participating in programming. There's also a list of voluntary, there's a list where the judge can have the discretion to make you a serious violent offender. And for the women, if you look at that, although it's an overall small number, what we see is, given the difference in the earned meritorious deduction, in particular if you draw your attention to FY 2015, we see that there's a relatively large increase in that year, and those few women can have an overall impact because their length of stay will be much longer. We also see a similar kind of trend in the violent offenders. And although it's a little down in FY 16, we see those effects for a period of time that goes forward as we look at the current number of women in the facility. We see with property crimes that that's increased also, but drug had gone down in FY 16. And New Mexico is also seeing a general decrease in DWI admissions, and public order kind of fluctuates and goes up and down. In terms of prison population forecasting, we really hone in on the serious violent offender and the violent, because those ones are the ones that we expect to have longer lengths of stay. The next graph looks at the quarterly new in prison admissions for females. So again, just to reiterate, new admissions are new crimes, whereas parole admissions are admissions for parole revocation. What we like to do is see what's driving the population. Is it people who are there for new offenses? Is it people who are being revoked? In the case of parole revocation, the department has a slight role in the number of admissions in that the parole and probation department does oversee parolees and has informal policies about how they handle violations, but ultimately it is the adult parole board that makes the decision about revocation. So in the early stages of offense, we often get questions from members of the legislature is somebody going back to prison the first time they have a dirty urine analysis? And from our investigations, that's not the case. The department works with offenders and tries to give them opportunities to not be returned to prison, but ultimately it lies with the parole board once a series of violations have occurred. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry about that. The next one that we look at is the next one that we're looking at is looks a little bit interesting at first look, but really what this is doing is it's looking at the net change. When we look at admissions versus releases, we look and then we rate it to the current month of populations for the facility. Basically, what's the percent of change? And if you look at over time, there has generally been more admissions. Admissions have outpaced releases for the females. And this is very critical. There are a few months that you see where releases outpaced admissions, but for the most part, it's definitely, they're getting more admissions than they can release. The other thing that's important to point out is if we had the men's graph up here, they all kind of hover around the 1% mark, up and down, and there's more of a scattering. In this case, there's a much higher concentration and they run higher percentages, which in a small population can really create crowding very quickly. The last graph, that table number 7 as it's labeled, looks at a graph from our earned meritorious deduction report. And this tells us the percent of the sentence that each individual prisoner is serving. As you can see, the serious violent offenders, of their total sentence, they serve 93% of that sentence. Of their prison sentence, meaning the times they're received at the Department of Corrections to release, that was running about 91%. So that just draws further emphasis to the importance of understanding that. We also see that individuals who are retakes on parole, that they serve the majority of their time left in the facility because they also receive only 4 days a month. This just gives you an idea of how much of their actual sentence each prisoner serves.
All right, and so why does all this matter at all? And the big reason why we say this is that when we start looking at this from a budgetary perspective. So recent numbers for us has shown that the average cost of a prisoner in New Mexico is $38,000 a year. Then we would assume that the daily cost is effectively $104.23. And that, assuming that we have a facility that holds roughly 1,000 people, if we have a change in 1 day, that's a difference of $104,000. And so as you can see that, you know, if there are these changes, there are massive costs to be had to the state and possibly savings. And that's why it's important to understand from a very large perspective of how are these policies affecting it and what can be done. And that's also assuming that these are not just fixed costs and that this is just from the individual itself. So any information that we can use to effectively aid corrections and the efficient use is a great benefit to this state, and I expect it's the same thing for everyone across the states as well, on understanding how these changes will affect the budget.
So at this point, I'd like to introduce Edward Smith, Budget Director and Co-CFO for the New Mexico Corrections Department. Ed, how do these forecasts inform current planning, and how could they be utilized in the future?
Good morning, everyone. Well, at the current time, we're already formulating our FY20 budget based on an update we got from the Sentencing Commission in March, showing about a growth of 106 men and 10 females at that point. So we've already started formulating. Actually, when you kind of start digging deeper than that, the average cost per inmate is $38,000, but there's big differences between public facilities and private facilities. We have a mix of 6 public and 5 private. So we're already analyzing with these numbers at a lower level to see what we're going to ask for, because it's going to be a lot more involved than just 112 times 38,000. So we're using that day in, day out, and we're looking forward to, in July, we get an annual population forecast from the Sentencing Commission that we'll use to drive our FY20 request, which is due September 1st. Longer term, we can also use this at a higher level with the executive and the legislative branch to see if maybe 6 or 8 years out we may have 600, 800 additional inmates. Is it time to look at a new facility? And we may not need a facility just for the growth, but in conjunction, we have a lot of aged facilities, so maybe in conjunction with, if a facility needs to close and they're projecting another 600 or 800 inmates, it might be time to be thinking 8 years down the road what the bonding capacity is going to look like and how we're going to house all these inmates.
Thanks.
And then this kind of brings us into some of the other stuff for future ideas. So some of the things that we wanted to look into as well was the classification bed capacity by facility. So normally we actually get the amount of bed capacity by the facility. However, that may not actually be able to tell the full story of each individual facility. There might be an overabundance of level 2s or 3s or 4s, and we can't actually actively forecast that beyond just knowing that what the facility levels are. And by having those classification bed capacities, we could actually be able to forecast possibly by those individual things, and so see if there would need to be a change in 2s or 3s or 4s for the future. Additionally, we were looking at also the rated capacity. So even though it's great that we have the full capacity, it's also important to understand how much what is the operational use of the beds, because you're only supposed to have, I believe it's 85%, 95%, somewhere around. Effectively, that way you can move prisoners around. And
right, when capital projects are going on and roofs are being repaired.
And so while it's great to have the total capacity, that doesn't actually reflect what the facility really can handle and should handle. Additionally, it might be useful in the future to begin to understand more of these earned meritorious deductions by facility. If we could individually pinpoint which facilities are doing great on good time or great on LSA, then we could see, okay, this certain facility might need increases, and that could be great for internal documents and, and to be able to move things around. Just because, again, those fixed costs, or not necessarily fixed costs, but those costs rotating by the facility and the prisoners, LSA may be more important in certain facilities than others, and no. The other thing possibly too would be infractions by facility. Are we seeing that this is also can be ending up increasing the length of stay, and it may not necessarily just be that our meritorious deductions are at fault or the policies are at fault, but it may be that there's just some sort of issue within the facility, and that might be a good thing for internal, and just seeing kind of if there is the capacity and the infraction or a number of other things that can come with it. One of the other things that we tried to work on specifically this last year with the prison population was giving a look more at the age of individuals in the facility. Even though you may have the same level of individuals year in, year out, if they're an older set of individuals, you're going to have higher medical costs. You're going to have higher other costs along the way, and that also can be useful in budgetary considerations of why that even though we have the same population, they're just getting older and we need more medical care for them. Or also we need more medical care in each of these different classification levels because of the age. We could also be looking into some of the medical usage by facility. Maybe that would be another way for an internal document to see how things are playing and if there's something that could be improvement or otherwise. One of the other ones as well is to work more on the controlled release and parole concerns by the facility. So are certain facilities doing great on being able to get people paroled on time or not, and is that driving the population? Because again, one of those concerns with the turnover is that if parole is changing or somebody else is changing, that may affect how many people are actually still in the prison because documents weren't able to get filed on time. And it's not, and no fault of the facility and no fault for the state, but it's just something to look at. Also looking into the prison population by classification level, that's been discussed for years, but maybe eventually we can look into that as well, more of understanding how the 2s and 3s are playing out, and that's a very dynamic question for the future. And is there anything that you guys can think of as well for aspirational ideas, Jerry or Ed?
Well, I was just thinking, you made the comment earlier about earned meritorious deductions, so I guess I was thinking if you guys had the ability to see like which facilities had more, then we could tie that to, okay, based on that, what programs were they, and then try to tie that to recidivism to come a different angle on tying, program participation and completion to recidivism.
Yeah.
Okay.
And with that, I believe we are now going to open it up for questions. If you ever wish to see some of our reports, our website is there, nmsc.unm.edu, or just New Mexico Sentencing Commission. Linda Freeman's email is there, as well as mine, Conner Tuttle. And then additionally, the graphs that we used early for understanding the overtime issue and then also the seasonal issue there. And with that, I yield.
So I'll start with one that was typed in. You talked about some of the variables. I don't remember what they all meant, but you had income inequality and poverty and things like that. But the question is, are there any other variables that you either do or would like to use for forecasting in the future?
I can speak to that. One of the things that we have tried to use in the past is we do a point-in-time study with the jails to look at the concentration of females in the jails. And we didn't really find that it was difficult to project out, and we really didn't find that it impacted the overall ability of the model to predict. I think there's been other variables that we've looked at in the past. We've looked at some educational variables, and Conner has recently taken a look at updating the projections, so perhaps he has other ones that he can add.
Just mainly seeing if there is some changes in UCR, but again, we're not really finding too much there. And then maybe we'll start looking at also if there's mental health or some other issues within the state.
So why other than contractual reasons, why the 3% margin of error?
Basically, the main reason is the contractual obligation to stay within the 3%. And I'll be quite honest with you, in terms of females, we've never hit that margin consistently, nor had the prior vendor ever hit that margin consistently. The issue with females is in New Mexico is a relatively small number, so it doesn't take much to derail it. And I think it's more aspirational. I mean, I think 3% is a margin that we can all live with. If we were getting, like, you know, really, with the females, we've been off as much as 10%, but if we get into anything above 10%, we're derailing the department's budget. So it kind of gives us a safe margin that as we get outside of that margin, we start to reconsider reprojecting. One time we actually kept a model at the department's urging because we had prior information that led us to believe that the population would in fact pick back up. And there's a lot of things that we cannot necessarily control. One of the other things that we had looked at in the past was the conviction rate at the district court to try to see if there's any relationship. We tried to look at relationships in the county, and what we found is that over time, there's not any patterns that evolve. All of a sudden, one county can send more women than they've ever sent before. So I think with the females, there's a little bit of, I guess, wider judicial discretion about sending women to prison that we don't see with the men, because the men have a lot more consistent basis in terms of their overall population and admissions and releases than the females. So we hope to spend some time this summer working on these issues about the female population and see if there's some factor that we could figure out to explain why we've seen increases in the last few years.
And then just to specifically note how small of a change it is due to the 3% with the females, we're talking about a difference of 25 people. And so that can easily be fluctuated by parole, that can be easily fluctuated by a number of other things. And so it's important to know that we try to stick within that value. So, but it is hard.
So, excuse me, another question. So how do you express or explain these types of issues that surround forecasting to legislators?
I think I'll give it a shot because I've done the presentation to the legislature the last few years. Basically, I think that most of the legislators, like when we show like the technical aspects of the model, they get a little glossy-eyed and they don't really understand necessarily that part. But some of the graphs I think make sense, and I think a lot of the legislators are drawing from their own experience of what they hear from constituents, what they hear from their peers. So when we look at the graphs, some of the graphs that I showed you guys, the admissions and the releases and the types of admissions and how they fall in various categories, I think that that's the level that they're really interested in. Probably like in the last 4 to 5 years, what's that look like? And I think that they understand that the forecast is necessary, but at the same time, I think that they're more rooted in like what's going on in the current moment. So what we have to do when we do the presentation is kind of quickly explain what the future looks like and use the current data to explain why we expect that the future looks that way. And I think most of the members of the legislature really value that information, but the technical components of it really are just difficult for them to understand.
So can you kind of talk about the life cycle of the process? This is something that happens every fiscal year. Can you talk a little bit about the process and the steps to get to the final projections and forecasts?
So I'm going to talk about the more administrative part, and then Conner can talk to you about how the administrative part feeds into what Conner does. So we host quarterly meetings with the Corrections Department where we present what has happened with the model in the last quarter. And we look at the whole fiscal year, basically. And at that meeting, we talk about any changes of policy. I'll give you an example of a recent earned meritorious deduction policy that is having an impact on the population, particularly the female population. At some point, it was decided that the Good Time Award would only be granted when the individual finished all the components of the program. So there may be programs that have phases, like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. If you were to finish phase 1, in some cases that used to be 30 days, and phase 2 is 30 days, and phase 3 is 30 days. They changed the policy that you did not get the 90 days until you finish phase 3. Well, that has a big impact for the females because we see females who come in with relatively short sentences, and it may not be possible for them to finish the whole program. In that case, if a female takes on that type of program, they have to understand they're going to be awarded no earned meritorious deduction. So that decision to change the award may influence what kind of earned meritorious deduction courses are offered and interest in those courses, because some inmates may not want to take a course that they're not going to get credit for. So all of our past data shows like the partial awards, and prospectively in the future, only those who complete the whole program will get the award. So we're always looking for feedback on those types of issues that we may not find out until far down the road. So at this quarterly meetings, we're able to discuss like internal policy changes, anything that might influence the model or influence what might be coming down the road, like overall differences in sentencing structure, if there's a sentencing enhancement that's being considered at the state level, if there's local issues with local jails and local jurisdictions. We talk about all those types of things. And then we kind of just have to take that information and make decisions about at what point it becomes appropriate with the advice and consideration of the department. When is it appropriate for us to reforecast? And Conner can walk us through what that looks like.
So we receive every single day's total prison population, the total counts between both male and female, and effectively we compile that every month to find the high count. We then use that high count value to then just effectively create the forecast and project it outward, and so we use the information that we've had from, I believe it's 2007 onward, to generate both the male and the female prison population. And additionally, we, as I was discussing earlier, we gather data from the American Community Survey, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and use that information to see if any of that has been useful in helping to predict some of the spikes and changes in the New Mexico prison population.
Okay, a question from Rajesh. Based on the projections, did you try to simulate corrective measures in the future that might affect the population growth? And if so, do you have any graphs showing an appropriate improvement for various corrective measures?
At the current time, we do not do that. However, that is definitely something that we could do into the future. So on that note, if the department directed us and asked us, we could create those types of simulations.
So earlier you had a slide that talked about why forecasts don't work. So in what context do they do, or so how long would you consider a forecast valid?
So long as the system maintains exactly where it is at the time we forecast, they should be valid as long as, it should be valid indefinitely. The issue is that when you start having changes in policy, you have changes that occur just due to natural cycles that can affect the forecast, and that's what screws it up. That's what might affect it.
But life is all about change.
Yeah, right, I guess. Exactly. and so ultimately, ultimately, try to stick to within 3 years is our go-to. We can rough maybe a 5-year estimate, but overall, anything that is beyond that point I would be a little skeptical of.
And just on that note, when we talk about our MINS forecast, we've had MINS forecasts that have lasted 3 years. And we've reprojected only to make a correction to systematic error where the model we stayed within 3%, but the model was always over-predicting. So if we're going to reproject the women, oftentimes we'll take a look at whether or not we should reproject the men. And if we see some elements of systematic bias, we will go back through and reproject. But the MINS model, when you talk about a population that's over 6,000, looking at 100 new people, is not quite as catastrophic as the women where we have limited facilities, and that 3% margin is very difficult because there's really no additional bed capacity for the women outside the 2 prisons that are currently available for women.
So, and the reason why I asked that, because there was a question on how useful is the forecast 10 years out. So I guess I was thinking, just based on the conversation, I mean, the further you go into the future, the more uncertain it is. Mm-hmm. So would a forecast of that length really be valid or useful?
Short answer, no. The state legislature, I think, likes to see that 10-year forecast. The other thing is I believe the prior vendor and other people who do this use a more black box kind of idea that has other elements in. But when we looked at prior forecasts, they were just as unreliable in the 10-year ranges as anything that we've projected. So.
Any other questions from anyone on the call? Okay, well, Linda, Conner, Ed, thank you all. That was a great presentation. Thanks to everyone that joined the call today as well. As always, if you have any comments, concerns, or future webinar ideas, you can send them to webinar@correctionstech.org. And CTA hopes you've benefited from our first webinar series. I've certainly enjoyed being your track chair. This concludes the series until after the CTA Annual Summit next month, June 3rd through the 6th in Daytona Beach, Florida. Hope to see you all there. Take care, everyone.
You should have gone there.